Well, hi everyone. My name is Jen. I'm a sociologist here at UCSF. I'm a qualitative researcher. I study experiences of health and illness and also study issues related to ethics. And welcome to the Wisdom Study Community Forum. So we meet here monthly to talk about different issues of interest to folks thinking about breast cancer and prevention and treatments. Some folks have been introducing themselves in the chat. If anybody else wants to, let us know where you're from, why you're here. We'd love to hear from you. So our format. So I know somebody, I was thinking one thing you were going to say is to mute folks. Oh, good. Somebody was off mute, but yeah, muting when you're not speaking, just so we can hear everybody. We like these forums to be dialogues. We are going to start with a presentation from Kim Vidal, who I'll introduce in just a second. She's going to give us some great information on research she's been doing, and then we'll open it up to a conversation. So feel free to put questions in the chat. As we get into Q&A, you can raise your hands. If you want to DM me and direct message me any questions, if you want me to ask them, that's great too. And we will have a great Q&A at the end. And we are recording. You all should have gotten a pop-up, and that's so we can share this with other folks. So if anything you don't want your name or face to be seen, that's fine. You can feel free to just send in a note and we can ask the question out loud. And then, yeah, we will have a survey at the end to get your feedback and also to think about discussion topics, which I think we have on the next slide. Is that right, Allison? Oh, 2 slides from now. So the reason we do these, the mission sort of the study and why we do these forums is we want to work together toward equity and better outcomes in breast cancer for everyone. And that's based on this idea that breast cancer isn't just one disease. We know that, right? There's so many different factors that influence who's getting cancer, what happens when they get cancer, how treatment goes when they get cancer. And we want to better understand that, right? And we're all sort of a piece of that puzzle. I think we're going to hear about a really important piece that is, I think, way under discussed today, and think about ways to understand that. But really with the idea that everyone should have a right to know their own personal risk and to think about if there's things you can do to mitigate that risk, or as I think comes up today, are there things we all need to be advocating for to improve, everybody's chances of not getting breast cancer? So in past months, what have we talked about? A lot of things. We've been doing these for a while now, which is great. We talked about breast cancer in different communities, specifically in the Black community. We've talked about different risk factors like density and how, depending on some of those risk factors. Talked about clinical trial participation. We've had some great sessions on genetics, on thinking about breast cancer at different ages when it occurs, things about breast cancer and nutrition, which is really interesting. I think all of those are posted on the website. I think that's right. I'm assuming that's right. And we can share the link for anyone who's missed any of these topics. And we really want to hear what other things you want to hear about. So you'll get a pop-up survey at the end to let us know if there's other topics you think are interesting. But today we're going to be talking about environmental risk factors for breast cancer, which is something that is incredibly important. As I said, it feels really understudied to me. And so we're going to hear about sort of new novel ways of trying to understand environmental risk for breast cancer. Are there any announcements? No, we're going right into it. So our speaker today is Kimberly Vidal, who is currently a postdoc here at UCSF and is an expert in way too many things. I'll let Kim introduce herself more, but every time I talk, I'm like, I don't even understand half of what you know. But I feel like, we're using machine learning and bioinformatics to help think about breast cancer and think about breast cancer risk and how we can best understand who's at risk and how to intervene, which is so far out of my wheelhouse. You can't even imagine, but I think it's really fascinating and there's really cool implications for health. So we're so excited to have you today, Kim. So why don't you take it away?
Awesome. So thank you so much, Jen. I'll just, this morning I was actually reflecting on the fact that I feel like I am studying so many things and that my brain is constantly being challenged. So I think that you're actually on point. I feel like I definitely do a lot of things, but because health is so integrative, right? And I've realized that I actually need to know a lot about multiple things in order to be at least effective. All right, so let me just give me 1 second while I share my screen. Are you seeing my screen? Yes, awesome. I just need to get, and you're still seeing it well because I need my presenter view. Okay, awesome.
Perfect on our end.
All right, awesome, guys. So thank you all so much for coming today to this community forum. As Jen said, I'm a postdoc here at UCSF with the Wisdom Study. I joined a year ago. My background is really in genetics and machine learning, so I'm essentially a bioinformatician, but I also have an NGO in the Caribbean where I'm from, Trinidad and Tobago. So I also work at the intersection of like policy, advocacy, all sorts of things. And so when I came to UCSF, I had a significant interest in looking at how environmental factors influence breast cancer risk. And I'll go into a bit soon as to why that is and why that interest came from, or where that interest came from. So just a quick background of how this presentation is going to go. First, I'm going to give you a brief background on what we know about environmental exposures and breast cancer risk. Disclaimer is that this is not my primary area of expertise. It is something that I'm interested in. And so if I can't answer your question, I will definitely do some research to be able to get those answers for you. Then I'm going to talk about how we are trying to gather environmental exposures in the wisdom cohort. Next steps of what we would like to do, and then we really hope to get your feedback on this work. So why did I get interested in this? So the backstory for me is I was actually born, raised, and educated on the compound of an oil refinery in Trinidad and Tobago. So Trinidad and Tobago is in the Caribbean. It's the last island in the Caribbean, right above Venezuela, and we have a strong oil and gas industry. We've had it since we got independence from the British in 1962. And on this oil and one of our major oil and gas refineries, on the compound is essentially a fully built out sort of ecosystem for people to live. So there is a hospital, there is a school, there is a church, and there are housing for the employees. This was left after because of our colonial history. So when the British left and we got our independence, they left all of this infrastructure. And so, the local people who then were working also at the oil and gas refinery then moved in. I had no idea about the exposures of living next to a refinery at that time. My mother didn't even know. And a lot of people, so my mother worked in the oil and gas company, and did my grandfather. So neither of them knew about the exposures that were related to cancer risk in terms of air toxins that they were being exposed to in this oil refinery. And so sadly, I've witnessed to this date, a lot of my mom's co-workers develop cancer. And from what I can just see, it's at an alarmingly high rate compared to the rest of the population. Also, interestingly, almost everyone in my class, so everyone who was born essentially on the hospital that was on this oil refinery, we all developed asthma. So I have asthma today, and I'm pretty sure that it was because of the location of my birth. But I was oblivious to all of this. I mean, I had a great childhood. This is me in my carnival costume, completely when I was 3 years old, completely oblivious to the exposures that I was having, and still having a generally good time. So, and bringing this into the US context and bringing it to today, I think the environmental exposures are something that, like Jen said, is completely, it is underscored how important environmental exposures could be in terms of developing cancer risk. And so just recently in East Palestine, Ohio, there was a train that was carrying vinyl chloride that derailed. Vinyl chloride, which is used to make PVC, and PVC is in our pipes, in our buildings, everywhere. Vinyl chloride is a known carcinogen, okay? It increases your risk for specific types of liver cancer. There's also increased risk for brain cancer, lymphomas, etc. And so this vinyl chloride has seeped into the groundwater. It is now in the landfills, and they've also burnt it off to try and get rid of the vinyl chloride that was there. And so now it is also an air toxin that exists in this area. And so vinyl chloride is part of what's called poison plastic manufacturing. Essentially, there is no known way to safely manufacture, use, and dispose of PVC products that come from this vinyl chloride. And then you see this manifested in certain geographic areas in the US. So for example, in quote unquote Cancer Alley, which is in Louisiana, which is something I actually just learned about a couple of days ago, there's high cancer risks in this area. And it is attributed to the number of chemical plants that are surrounding in this area. And one of these plants include a plant that manufactures vinyl chloride. And, you know, the increase in the risk of cancer in these areas is well documented, and you can see that in the literature. So if we take a little bit of a step back out, we see that we know that there's geographic differences in terms of the incidence of breast cancer, okay? So the darker the blue, the higher the incidence. So we know that more industrialized nations, such as the US, Canada, countries in Europe, Australia, et cetera, have higher incidence rates than the less developed, less industrialized countries. And then when we look at the mortality, it's essentially the flip. The map is the flip. So where there is high incidence, there's now lower mortality. And where there was lower incidence, there's now higher mortality. So there is, you know, just looking at this map of the world, you can begin to think about that place is an important factor in terms of the development of breast cancer. And now we know that there are certain factors associated with living in an industrialized nation that increase your risk for breast cancer, some of which exist in the environment, which is what we're going to talk about today. And even if you look closer at the US, so this is a very interesting map of incidence rates in the US by, this is incidence rates overall on the left, and then incidence rates by stage, which is on the right. And if you look interestingly here at the northeast corner of the US, you see that there's a lot of red, and a lot of red means high incidence rates of breast cancer. But when you look at the distribution by stage, you can see that although there are high incidence rates of breast cancer, most people are being actually diagnosed at earlier stages in this northeast area, but you don't see the same thing tracking in other parts of the country. And so there's several factors that will influence that, some of which is screening practices, but you also do have to question and think about what is the impact of the environment, the built environment, the social environment, the chemical environment that is also contributing to this variation that we see here. And even if we look closer and into California, and we look even closer into the Bay Area, again, a lot of red means high incidence. We see high incidence rates of breast cancer in Marin, San Francisco, San Mateo, Santa Cruz area. That's where all this red is. But when we look at the late stage disease, we really only see high late stage incidence of late stage diseases in Marin County and in Santa Cruz. And, you know, again, then it begs the question, why? So there are patterns of incidence rates by geography that are not always intuitive. I mean, looking at this map, you know that there's differences by geography, but why that is the question that comes up now. For Marin, for example, it's the high consumption of alcoholic beverages, a lot of wine that has been shown to be increasing the breast cancer rates for women in Marin County. But then another question is why there, not San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to highlight the work by the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners. They developed the California Breast Cancer Prevention Plan. This is a 400-page document that I actually do recommend that people read. It is a document that highlights many different risk factors for breast cancer in a very digestible way. It's very easy to understand and take in, even though it's 400 pages. But it's also very comprehensive. So they go into both risk factors that exist in an environment, like we'll talk about today, behavioral risk factors, lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. And the good thing about this document is that it highlights very well that breast cancer is not simply about the individual. And I think we have a very individualized approach to thinking about breast cancer risk. It also risk is also determined by the society in which you live in, okay? And they do a very good job at highlighting that the society has the potential to function in a way that not only protects people's health, but also builds resilience. So I do highly recommend that you will, if you're interested more in this work, to please go to this website and get this document. Also because they have 4 focuses. So they focus on primary prevention. So what can you do? okay, to reduce your breast cancer risk. So they highlight things that you know already, like exercise more, drink less alcohol, but they also highlight things like the chemicals within your personal care products and what you should avoid. They distill a lot of the information that exists, and I think they highlight it in a very important way. They also focus on the systemic interventions that need to happen. So what needs to happen on a society level, because like I said, breast cancer risk is not just about you as an individual, but also about the society in which you operate. They also take a social justice lens, which I think is very, very important, particularly for the US. Because we know that there's a history of underrepresentation, discrimination, disadvantage, that also confers risk here in the US in terms of breast cancer risk. And they also integrate both the science and the community wisdom, which is exactly also what wisdom does. So don't get overwhelmed by this plot. This plot is essentially a summary, a proposed summary of all the factors that we know influence breast cancer risk to some degree, okay? And this amazing diagram is an interactive diagram that you can find at the website here, which was developed by Bob Hyatt and colleagues here at UCSF. And so you can see what I want you to take away from this is only one thing, which is that it's complex. It's a huge web of interrelated factors that influence breast cancer risk. Some are better established, right? So for example, age, the age at your first period, your age at menopause, your genetic polymorphisms, like what wisdom is doing, breast density, etc. But there are also others that are less well established, but equally compelling. So for example, environmental exposures, occupational exposures, example, light at night. So this is for shift workers. Also things like your vitamin D intake, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we also have to ask ourselves whether or not, given that this is what we know about the complexity of breast cancer risk factors, whether or not we are actually hitting the nail on the head in terms of considering all we need to consider when estimating breast cancer risk. And this is a simplified version of this diagram, right? That diagram, even for me as a researcher, was a lot to take in, and I've been playing around with it. But this, I think, is a much more simplified, easier version. And I just want to highlight here on certain risk factors that influence breast cancer that are related essentially or interact with the environment, interact with place. So then first for the US, there's race and power inequities, which have been well documented. Breast cancer is not equally distributed across all races and ethnicities in the US, and race and ethnicity is related to socioeconomic status and so many other statuses that then influence also the environment in which you live. There's also the social and built environment. So by social environment, we mean essentially what's related to your socioeconomic status, and your built environment is where you live, where you work, and where you play. There are other things such as ionizing radiation. So for example, with the atomic bomb that happened in Hiroshima in Japan, there's a significant increase in cancer risks there. After September 11th in the USA, people living within the vicinity of that, and also workers who were first-line workers, there were also increased risks of cancers there. So also things related to your occupation. So people who are farmers, people who work in healthcare, actually, radiation technicians, et cetera, pesticide applicators. There's a long list of occupations that, because of the work they do, the chemicals they're exposed to, the environment in which they work, they have increased risk for different types of cancer, including breast cancer. And then we have place-based chemicals. So what's in your land, what's in the water, what's in the air, okay? And there are many, many place-based chemicals that we can look at. And even something like ambient noise. I did not know that higher road traffic noise exposure over a long period of time increases your risk for breast cancer. So there are lots of things that, even as me as a single researcher, I do not know or understand the full gamut of things that influence our breast cancer risk, which is also why we need to be a little bit more integrative in understanding these things. So I just want to put this into context of why understanding the environment and specifically chemical exposures within the environment, which is going to be the focus of the work that we're doing right now, are important risk factors. So the World Health Organization and the International Agency for Research on Cancer estimated that about 7 to 19% of cancers are attributable to toxic environmental exposures. That's a pretty high number, all right, considering that we think somewhere or, less than 10% of women have genetic predispositions to high penetrant genetic predispositions to breast cancer. So it's a significant number that warrants investigation. And there have been multiple studies all over the world. So for example, in Nigeria, there's a study that showed that the increasing breast cancer incidence there is partly attributed to the heavy metal contaminants in the soil, because there was a lot of industrialization that happened in Nigeria and it went unregulated. So heavy metals that have not been disposed of properly, and they've been leaching into the soil, into the water, etc. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, we know because of our huge oil and gas industry that there's a bioaccumulation of heavy metals in the fish. We haven't been able to look at how that influences breast cancer in the Trinidad and Tobago population, but it's not a far stretch to think that it also influences our cancer risks. In Italy, women living in 8 out of 14 major industrial areas had elevated breast cancer risk. Okay, another study that was shown. In the USA, their studies have shown that women living in previously red line neighborhoods had elevated breast cancer risk. And also, like I said before, there's a higher cancer incidence in civilians after the September 11th attack. And that is attributed to the fact that the dust and the fumes, etc., was a complex mix of suspected and known carcinogens that were then exposed into the air and people were breathing it in, etc. So what I have noticed from all the research that I've read is that essentially the environmental exposures of breast cancer risk disproportionately affect people in lower socioeconomic status and those living in developing countries. And so I think if we want to talk about equity, we cannot discount the effect of the environment on people's health. So in reading the breast cancer prevention plan for California that was developed that I mentioned to you earlier, there are 4 key points that I summarized those 400 pages to these 4 key points for you. So as I said before, there are several breast cancer risk factors that exist in the social and built environment. And these factors, especially in the US, interact with measures of disadvantage, okay, whether it be socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, etc. These spatial risk factors, they overlap, they interconnect, and then they drive some variation in risk. So if you're living in an area with, for example, high exposures to air toxins, you probably also have high exposures to something else that is also increasing your breast cancer risk. So these things tend to compound because they are also associated with disadvantage. The timing and the duration of exposures matters, and this is what I think has been the key hurdle to us actually moving forward and integrating this into our research practices, is that the window of exposure matters, and the window of exposure has been shown to matter from prenatal up until, in some cases, your first full-term birth and periods in between that. So, I mean, and then how do we ascertain somebody's environmental exposures over their life history? It's a very challenging question that we have to answer. And this is, like, as I said, an understudied field of research. So there's still a lot that is unknown about how the environment affects breast cancer risk. So what are the questions that we're asking right now in Wisdom? The first question is whether or not we can use geocoding to better describe the cohort diversity. So like I said, measures, so people in lower socioeconomic status, people who have more disadvantage are more likely to be exposed to some of these environmental factors. And so it seems to me that we should also be describing cohort diversity in terms of some of these exposures, or in terms of places in which people live. And then, can we then capture environmental breast cancer risk factors within wisdom? And then is there a relationship between the disadvantage, race and ethnicity, and higher exposure to environmental toxins, as has been seen in the literature? Does that also exist within wisdom? So these are the first preliminary questions that we are asking. So to do this, what we've done is we've taken each wisdom participant address that you have given us. Then we assign that address to either a census tract, a zip code tabulation area, or a county. The difference here is really what is available and what data we're then using to map that onto. So we take that census tract, for example, and then map it to another variable that exists from publicly available data sets. So we're mapping on a lot of different variables for each wisdom participant. I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but just to highlight 3 of them. So we're looking at one, the area deprivation index, which I will talk to you about, the environmental justice screen, another one I'll talk about, and also the incidence rates for breast cancer that exist in that county. Okay. So area deprivation index, this is a composite index. So it uses 17 indicators, such as poverty, housing, education, and employment to classify a census tract's relative deprivation, all right? So it's really on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being the least deprived. So so there'll be more poverty, less housing, less education, et cetera, less employment. From most deprived, which will be more poverty, less housing, less education, et cetera, to the least deprived, which will be the opposite of that. All right, so pretty straightforward index. Just a quick glance at the wisdom population. So wisdom population, the majority of the population, so 45% of the population are in the top 3 ADIs, so the least deprived values, right? So wisdom population, most people live in least deprived areas, all right? And only 9% of the population live in the bottom 3 ADIs, so in the most deprived areas. Okay, so wisdom is not exactly reaching the people who live in the most deprived areas of the country. And this has also implications for recruiting efforts, et cetera. So you can already see the value of doing geocoding based on other factors to help guide understanding diversity. And so we also see variation by site. Okay, so this is just our top 6 recruiting sites. And you can see that at UCSF, the vast majority of people who enroll through UCSF are in the least deprived areas. I mean, San Francisco, you can imagine that. But then when we just go over to UCD, Davis, then you can see there's a more even distribution across all ADIs. And so at UCD, they are recruiting people in the lower ADIs, which also, again, is giving us some information about we should probably tailor our recruitment efforts. So I'm going to integrate all these variables, but I first need to tell you about the environmental justice screen. So the environmental justice screen is done by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and is essentially a measure of 12 environmental toxins, all right, and 12 environmental indicators. And so we've mapped each of these indicators onto each participant in wisdom, okay, and determined where does that participant lie in terms of the national percentiles or averages expected. So for example, the question is whether or not this participant lies in the top 25 fifth percentiles of exposures to particulate matter or to ozone or to air toxic cancer risk, et cetera. So just to quickly, we have not done all of this analysis here. The ones in greens are the ones that we're looking at now. I'm just going to quickly tell you what is known about these variables. So particulate matter, 2.5. So this is fine particulate matter, right? 2.5 just means that particles in the air are less than 2.5 microns. So really, really, really small particles. And so exposures to these particles in the air have short-term health effects. So for example, when your eyes start to itch, your throat starts to itch, you have asthma, coughing, etc. You can see when the air gets heated, all right? But long-term exposure to the high PM 2.5 levels was shown to be associated with premenopausal breast cancer, and specifically more aggressive ER negative premenopausal breast cancer. Then there's also ozone. Everybody knows that the ozone is necessary for us to protect ourselves from the radiation from the sun. But interestingly, you have lower ozone concentrations in cities because you have other toxic chemicals in the airs in cities that then degrades the ozone. There haven't been studies that have directly related ozone concentrations to breast cancer risk, but ozone concentrations is a known environmental toxin. Air toxics, cancer risk, these are just all the toxic compounds, fumes, vapors, some diesel, etc., that exist in the atmosphere. So these are a composite of many different compounds and then increase your risk for cancer. RMP facilities. So essentially, from what I understand for this, is that there are specific extremely hazardous manufacturing facilities in the US that have, do some significant high risk chemical manufacturing or whatever they use it in their process. And these facilities are required to have what is called an accident management plan. So these facilities have been singled out as being, essentially high risk, essentially. And so your proximity to these facilities is one variable. And then another variable is your proximity to Superfund sites. So a Superfund site is a contaminated site. And so it means essentially that it may have been contaminated by hazardous waste being dumped there, hazardous waste being left out in the open, or a site that was just improperly managed because of whatever reason. And so these include manufacturing sites, landfills, etc. All right, so your proximity to these sites has been shown to increase your risk for specific breast cancer. And what you see is that essentially people have looked at, for example, I read a study, people looking at the toenails of people who live close to Superfund sites, and they found high elevated levels of specific metals that were associated with that Superfund sites. So essentially, I suppose people are walking around, you're showering, etc. It's everywhere, and it's bioaccumulating in your body, which I found to be very interesting. And also, and it is known that geographic areas around Superfund sites have elevated cancer risk. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. All this is just to show you is that this is where Wisdom participants fall in terms of their ranking percentile for each one of these environmental toxins compared to the national. Okay, so for example, for PM 2.5, you have Wisdom participants living below the national median percentile, which is in red here, and above. Okay, for many of them, we see a large variation. However, for if you look at this one, which is respiratory risk, you see most of the participants are above the national average in terms of exposure to respiratory risk toxins. For exposure proximity to Superfund sites, we see that Wisdom participants are generally below the national average for exposure to Superfund sites. And so we did this to try and understand what is the variation that exists, because you need variation in order for you to, from a computational perspective, to be able to essentially accurately predict risk. You need people on both ends of the spectrum in order for you to do your analysis. Okay, so we have some work here I think we need to do in terms of as we continue to recruit more diverse participants, to continue to look at how this changes over time. So as I said before, we've taken all Wisdom participant addresses and we've mapped them onto an area deprivation index. And then we've also mapped it onto each of the 12 environmental justice screen variables, okay? And we've only just started to do this analysis like last week, okay? And I was working all weekend as well on this. So I'm just going to give you the key summary findings so we can actually get into discussion. And I would say that nothing here is particularly surprising. I think everything here tracks with what has been noticed in the literature. So when we do analysis by race and ethnicity, we see that Black and African American women are more likely to live in the most deprived areas of the US. Okay, so these are in area deprivation indexes in the lower tier, so 1 to 3 essentially. Sorry, 8 to 10. And we see that these higher area deprivation indices is also associated with higher exposure to some environmental toxins, not all in the 12, but some. And we also see that these areas that have higher area deprivation, they also have higher incidence of late stage disease. Okay, so these are people who are coming in with advanced disease. So all of this sort of tracks around you with what has been noted in terms of the relationship between race and ethnicity and essentially disadvantage, compounding disadvantage that exists in the US. And what's interesting is that we also see that on the opposite end, right? So that people who live in lower area deprivation places, so these are people who are predominantly white, they live in places that have higher overall incidence rates, right? So overall incidence rates, but they do not have higher late stage incidence rates. So to summarize all of that, I would say is that area deprivation is related to, interacts with race and ethnicity. It also interacts with high exposure to environmental toxins, and all of that interacts with the incidence of disease, particularly the stage at which people are diagnosed. And so a following question, and I mean, there are many variables that can explain this relationship, especially, when you talk about race and ethnicity and late-stage diagnosis, like poor access to healthcare, mistrust of healthcare, et cetera. But we're not also considering how exposure to environmental toxins also then contributes to late-stage disease. And so the question that I'm pondering is whether or not these exposures to environmental toxins also confer risk for more aggressive disease. Because when you have more aggressive disease, you're more likely to be diagnosed at later stages, okay? Even if you're getting screened. Just to illustrate this point very quickly, and then this will be my second to last slide. So this is the percentage of the population that is exposed to the highest quartile, so the highest levels of these 5 environmental indicators, okay? So when you compare people in the most deprived areas compared to the least deprived areas, you see that in the most deprived areas, you see that there's a higher proportion of people who are now exposed to the highest levels of ozone. They are closest to RMP proximity sites. They also have higher exposure to cancer risk air toxins, and then they have also slightly higher proximity to Superfund sites. And all of these relationships, I'm only showing you the relationship here for the highest exposure, so the top quartile, but all of the relationships with all quartile from all the analysis we've done shows that there is a significant association. So essentially, area deprivation is associated with some high environmental exposures, right? The PM25 is in the opposite direction, and you could kind of expect that because high PM25 levels is usually associated with very built environments, cities, et cetera. For example, LA has extremely high PM2.5 levels. Okay, so what are our next steps right now with the work that we're doing? The first thing that we would like to do is determine whether or not we can gather residential histories for Wisdom participants, and particularly through a third-party vendor. As I said before, with Wisdom, we have your primary address at the point at which you enrolled. We may have updated addresses thereafter, but like I said, the timing of exposures matters. So using your exposure at one time point in your life might not be the best way to go about this analysis, or best way to estimate your environmental exposure. So now we need to get a history of residents of where you've lived. And there are some third-party vendors, like everything in the US, there's always a third-party commercial vendor who can who we can get this data from. And so we have to determine whether or not that is something that we can feasibly do with participant consent. We also want to include a question on chemical exposures based on occupational history for the reasons that I've mentioned before. And so we need to build out what that question would look like. It's not a very simple question to ask, right? And we also are interested in determining whether or not we should or could report back to participants on environmental exposures at their address. And the interesting thing is that there's also actually now a whole funding mechanism for this specific area of research with the NIH, because of the importance that they see that participants know what is going on in their built and social environments. So, but there are several caveats to that. Your environmental sport, remember, we're mapping this on to a county, right, or a census tract. So it's not very granular. It tells you what's going on in your general area, which might not be true for you specifically. Also, we're not considering these environmental exposures in the risk model. We are a bit far away from being able to do that. There's a lot of computational mathematical things that we need to figure out first. And again, even if we were to get residential histories from this third-party vendor, the beginning age is 18. Okay, so it doesn't seem like, without asking participants directly, it doesn't seem like we'll be able to get your residential history without you doing all the work of actually telling us throughout your whole life history. And like I said, there have been studies that shown that prenatal development and also early childhood development is the exposures then is very important. So then how do we estimate that? And then even if we give you back information on your environmental exposures, then what will you do with that information? Okay, I mean, it's a very, pertinent question. And the interesting thing is that a lot of this has been, to an extent, investigated in genomics research, right? When people report back information on your genetic variants, particularly your variants of unknown significance. And so there's an opportunity for us to probably learn from there, but it's still a new field to be investigated. And future lines of inquiry, just things we're thinking about, okay? Which you might also be thinking about too. Like I said, a high environmental exposures associated with more aggressive breast cancer. Are there biological signatures of environmental risk? I think that is like the key important thing, because if we cannot get your residential history over long periods of time, can we estimate that using something in your biology, whether it's your serum, your blood concentrations of specific environmental toxins, or some epigenetic effects in your genome? Remains to be seen. And particularly, one thing I'm interested in is, can the inclusion of breast cancer risk factors, environmental risk factors, improve our prediction of who is getting breast cancer and what type of breast cancer they'll get, specifically for disadvantaged persons? And would educating the community on environmental risk factors promote environmental justice initiatives? So this might be one very good reason to give people back or report back information on their environment. And last thing I would say is that if you're interested in this topic, I thought this was very interesting. Just a couple of days ago, I think it was like last Friday, that Biden signed an executive order to advance environmental justice in the U.S. So essentially, there's a new department in the government now that is specifically going to address environmental justice issues, particularly in communities where toxic substances have been released from federal facilities. So there will be some sort of avenue channel to address that. And so that is the end of my presentation. I mean, there are lots of people at UCSF working on this presentation. I want to especially thank Catherine, who's been computating away with me as we work on this project. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, that was fascinating and a lot of information that I know, like, I'm totally still digesting. I'm sure others are too. We've had a few comments start to come in the chat, but if folks have questions they want to put in the chat or raise your hand to ask out loud, we can do that. Kim, do you want to take your slides down? We can all see each other, yeah. Those of us who are on screen. And I know, I'm so intrigued by this work, and I'll just start with a question, or maybe it's sort of in some ways raising it for the rest of the group, but folks think about questions too. I feel like some of the key questions you raised are really interesting ethical questions. Like you say, third party, whatever, and I'm like, oh, I don't trust any companies. Like what? Like that totally creeps me out. Does that creep other people out? How should we think about the ways to get this data? And I think these questions are like, is it valuable to both gather and return this data to folks if there isn't anything you can do about it, if we don't fully understand the meaning? I think are great questions to raise that, you're right, have been tackled or thought about a lot. I don't know if they've been tackled, but haven't thought about a lot in genetics. But how do
Yeah.
we think about this with environmental exposures? What does it mean to tell someone, hey, the place you live is this, when like, I feel like it's so interesting to me. I don't know. I'm curious what others think. Like genetics, like I just can't do anything about it. I just like can't change my genes, right? But like theoretically, like I could move, but that doesn't mean I actually can, right? It takes money and resources and time. I can't just decide. Yet it. So I don't know. I'm so intrigued what other people think about this as well. And oh, I'm just seeing a chat from someone on our team that there's going to be some poll questions that'll launch at some point that ask what folks think about this, about sharing data. So maybe we can do a few more minutes of conversation and then see what people think. So I'm seeing in the chat, some folks are noting ways to access census records, and also noting that census records aren't always accurate because of who's willing to answer the surveys, which is really important. I think is really interesting. Some people noting experiences of seeing this in their own lives, which is really interesting. Just scrolling through.
I received a question as well that I just wanted to pass along.
Please. Yeah.
Well, I guess more of a comment, but this person was basically asking how we might use people's addresses in wisdom for this information. And just pointing out that the current address is the only address on their people's wisdom file, but that doesn't reflect their whole residential history, and they may have previously lived somewhere. And then also wondering, especially in areas like San Francisco, that it really does vary from neighborhood to neighborhood. And how would you factor that in more than just a general region?
Yeah. So lots of interesting and also tough questions. So the first question is, yes, we are aware that we only have the first address, and that's the example, the reason why we would like to get residential histories. So getting residential histories in geographical research has been done before. It's been done at UCSF, it's been done at other research institutions, etc. And so essentially what you do is there's a third-party company called LexisNexis, and there are other companies as well. I'm not really exactly sure what they do. Is, a lot of these companies is like smoke and mirrors. But anyway, what you can do is based on your name and your current address, they map your name and current address to other databases. They said that they have 10,000 different data sources, and then they're able to get your residential history. So where you've lived and the dates in which you've lived there. When I first heard of this, I thought, oh my gosh, this is so creepy. But then I was like, this is also the system in which we live here in the US, where you basically, your data is everywhere. And so we would have to first get consent from each wisdom participant. And then we'd have to use your name and your address to then get your, to give to this third party company, who then get your residential history over a time period, of course. They have their own checks and balances. We've talked to them. They're pretty robust when it comes to, or pretty critical in terms of giving out information for research purposes. And we're also leaning on the expertise, if we decide to do this, of people at UCSF who've already done this. Again, this is not like groundbreaking. There's nothing new that we're doing. It's just using a similar system. So the last question about, the lack of the granularity, right? Where there's so much difference, like if you use San Francisco, for example, there's so much difference in between neighborhoods, etc. And until, if anybody knows of any more granular data source, until we can get a granular data source, there's really nothing that we can do right now about it. But there are steps. I think, with research, everything builds, right? So when you use a measurement that's usually not granular, if the effect is truly there and it's a large effect, you would still see the effect, right? It's just there might be a variation of the effect within the group. So I think there's still value, even though it is not completely granular, but we have to, we have to take some steps forward in order for us to get this research going, because, eventually long-term, what I would hope to see is, as I said before, what are the biological signatures, which I think will be probably the most accurate estimate for an individual. I think it's very difficult for any individual to measure on a granular, accurate scale what their environmental exposures are, because they're living in a house and then they're moving from that house to their workplace, all of which is very, very different. And so I've seen, for example, researchers at Harvard use their GPS location of individuals and essentially continuously map, and then use all of that data to then map an environmental exposure. But for all of those places, you don't know all of the environmental exposures you have. And then also it's computationally extremely expensive to do that. Like that's a lot of data, a lot of time, a lot of resources. So my hope is that we could start using granular, metrics that are not as granular, and then move forward in the future to ones that are more individualized and based on what is happening in your own body. So to do that, we have to figure out how does your body internalize, like what happens in your body when you're exposed to these different things. And that is like translational research. We have to partner with people at the bench, people in environment, people all over, et cetera. I hope that answers.
And am I right then, and we'll go to Diane then, but assuming then that the understanding is that like two people could have the exact same exposure to really toxic bad thing we know is bad and react differently. One person could get a cancer or have this effect and another person can't, but we don't totally understand yet why, right?
Yeah, and it could be other factors. So like you have two people, they have the same environmental factors, but suppose one exercises more, has less stress because they internalize the environment differently. Because there's so many risk factors and they're all intertwined, it will be difficult to like pinpoint exactly,
like those complicated maps you showed, right? There's so many factors.
So
I want to go to Diane's question, and then I think Allison is going to launch, or somebody's going to launch the poll questions when we can sort of have that on the side happening and people can answer as Diane, you ask your question.
Yeah. So those of us who've had environmental breast cancer training learned that there are windows of susceptibility in a woman's life when it's more likely that impact would have it during that period for cancer then or later, right? We know cancer takes a long time to form. So my question, and you kind of mentioned this, Kim, but the in utero part, but not just the mother being exposed to environmental toxins, but the hormones that are surging in utero because of stress. So I'm just gonna, I know as advocates, we're not supposed to talk about ourselves, but this has always bothered me. So I'm 18 months younger than my sister. We grew up in the same way, I've had breast cancer 4 times, and she has smoked since college. Nothing, no cancer. So I just have this theory that something possibly, and like you said, it's so complicated because there's so many inputs that could happen, right? Which is why we're always told more isn't being done with environmental research because humans are so complex in that way. But I'm just wondering, has anybody ever done that kind of research about we know a lot is determined in utero.
Yeah. Yes. So there has been a lot of research about risk factors in utero. Yes, environmental risk factors. I think I saw some research on stress-based factors that occur and then during utero, et cetera. But, in terms of the volume of research compared to the volume of research that's being done on genetics, hereditary, it's like 100 to 1, right? So there has been research showing that whether or not it is in the mainstream is another question, right? And whether or not you have to also remember that it's very difficult to think about how to study these factors and integrate them on a practical level. So wisdom is a practical study. Right. We need to collect practical variables that can be collected about people. And, I also always think about the fact that, wisdom is so innovative. But then I also think back to where I come from, Trinidad, and I know that, something like wisdom will not happen in our near future because of the inputs. The inputs are so difficult, particularly for people in developing countries, et cetera, to collect. So this is a really roundabout way of answering a question. Yes, I think there has been research done on it. I could probably look some up and also send it to you. But then the question becomes, to what extent do we measure these risk factors in a practical way?
Right. I mean, who even knows?
Yeah, we don't know that. I mean,
Our
right
mothers are long gone, there's, and yeah, okay. So it
Definitely
just,
something it'll be interesting to see in the next generation. Like I know now, like UCSF has done studies, they would collect people's placentas and cord blood to measure exposures in utero. And so I'm so curious, what will we know 50 years from now if those people are being cohorted and followed? I don't know if they are, but I'm hopeful that we'll know more, right? Yeah.
That's very interesting.
well,
We
well,
just,
those are commercial companies, right? I mean, the majority of cord blood that's stored is commercial companies.
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. I was talking about like a study that was done, not banking it, but like studies being done. But yeah,
okay,
banking is
because
what happens to all
that's
that.
probably
Yeah.
so much just sitting there right now. It's a
Just in case. Yeah.
amazing, right,
Yeah. There's
resource.
a lot that we will.
Totally. And so I'm curious, we have to wrap up. We have 2 minutes left. And, I know that Kim, you're more on the bioinformatics side of this, the understanding, but I'm curious, you've spoken to a couple of resources, but if you have things you can point people to, like what are the best resources for understanding this? Like, I know I really struggle with, I've been very worried about environmental exposures. I make my own conditioner, make my own lotions. Like I don't trust any commercial companies. But then you read things that the websites that track this are all garbage science. It's not real. Figuring out what you should trust and what you shouldn't. Do you have sources that you trust on this? And then also, if you think you've had environmental exposure, someone was talking about growing up near a freeway entrance. If you grew up near one of these disaster sites, what can people do? Are there things we can do now in thinking about our breast cancer risk when we don't have all the science yet?
So the first thing I would say is in terms of reputable sites, there are two that come to my mind. So first is the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners website. They actually have a tab that basically goes through all of your environmental exposures and what recommended advice. So even the chemicals in your cosmetics, stay away from fragrance, So I think they are reputable and they have really good information. So Breast Cancer Prevention Partners, the Environmental Working Group, I think it's the Environmental Working Group site where they have information on, I think you can input your product, type in your product, and then it will give you a list on a scale of whatever to whatever about how dangerous this product is. So I have used that site as well. So those are two that I can recommend off the top of my head. I would say though that I think it's quite impossible. I think we should not stress, okay? I think we should not stress about everything that exists in our environment that could possibly cause cancer, okay? The fact that we're living longer just means we're going to accumulate risk over time and exposures to more things. And stress is a factor. So I always tell people, even if you can't afford organic fruit, please eat the fruit because you can, there's value in the fruit. And then at some point, sometimes you hear research saying that the pesticide is a problem. Next time you hear research saying pesticide is not a problem. So, I would say my recommendation is just, try to live an overall holistically healthy life and don't fixate on any one specific thing. Because if you, for example, fixate on, what's in your water, then there might be something in your air, right? Or there might be something in the tea that you're drinking because the tea comes from a pesticide-laden farm. I think it's quite impossible for us to consider everything. And so I think you just do your best to live a healthy lifestyle, reduce your stress, you do the big level things, reduce your stress, exercise, eat well, and don't say, know your risk through wisdom. That's the other thing I would say. And then you kind of have to leave the rest and see how the science evolves. I mean, even for me with my mother, who, I'm very concerned that she will eventually develop cancer because of her exposure, so for her life course. I also know that I can't stress and worry about it too much because there's variation. So my grandfather, he lived till 85. He never And he was exposed since he was born, and he did not develop any kind of cancer. So there are also people who, but he was also a person who drank, smoked, but he also exercised every day. Who knows? Who knows?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I love the message of like stress is bad too. I feel like that really helps me. Like if you're staying up all night worrying about which exposure, that also is going to do damage. So yeah, living a healthy life. So there's still a poll up if anyone wants to answer about future topics for this discussion. This has been so wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Badal, for sharing with us about this topic. If folks have additional questions, feel free to send them in, and we can try to get any answers we can. As we talked about, this is evolving science, and we really appreciate your feedback on how we should be thinking about this in this study as we move this forward. We want to make sure we do it in a way that is meeting people's needs, is respectful of all the tricky ethical issues, and is advancing this important science. So yeah, I'm just making sure going through my checklist of all the reminders I'm supposed to do, filling out the polls. We did that. Kimberly mentioned sign up for Wisdom if you haven't already. Know your risk, which is good. I think the next phase of Wisdom will be opening sometime soon. I think it's paused right this second, but then people will be able to sign up again. And join us next month. We'll be in touch. You'll hear more about the upcoming topics, and feel free to share this around if others would be interested.
And just one quick note, next month, the last Monday of the month is Memorial Day. So we'll actually be moving it a week earlier to the 22nd. So we'll update the calendar and update the links. And if you've registered, then you're already pre-registered for all the future forums. So you can use the same information, but look for May 22nd is our next forum. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.